What's up, guys? So as promised in the previous video where I installed a Malone Stage 1 delete tune on my 2014 Volkswagen Jetta, we are going to finally jump into the mechanical side of things. So this is going to be part one of a two-part remove and install of these aftermarket parts, but the removal is going to be removal of the EGR, the ASV, the EGR Cooler, and the stock exhaust. The only thing that I will not be showing in these two videos is wrapping the hood stack that I got from Darkside in the respective header wrap, and that's just because I don't have a vise here, so don't really want to take the camera and whatnot. But before we get started, go ahead and like and subscribe and comment any questions that you have during the video. But currently we are at 350 subscribers, right at 60-something thousand views and a little over 3,000 watch hours, so I cannot say how much I appreciate all the support, but let's jump into it. Okay, so here are all of the parts that I have purchased for the hood stacking of this car. And this is obviously going to not include the tuner and or programmer, the flashzilla that I got from Malone. That is inside. You can see all of that in the previous video. But here is going to be the hood stack, which is actually a 3-inch hood stack from Darkside. Here is block off plates, necessary fittings and whatnot to do the EGR removal. That is going to be your exhaust clamp. This here is going to be the hole saw that I'm going to use. I'm going to use a 4.5-inch hole saw. Here is your EGR/ASV race pipe delete with all of the necessary bolts and whatnot. And then here is just the header wrap that I bought off of Amazon that we are going to use to wrap the Darkside stack. And this one here is kind of important. A lot of people don't have this in their garage. But for these Volkswagens, you do need what they call a triple square set, because there's a few of them. But as you can see, it kind of looks like a Torx, but it's really not. It is just a triple square set. I think I got that for 20 bucks on Amazon as well. But let's jump into the removal of all these parts. Okay, so we're going to start the disassembly at the top of this engine. First and foremost, we're going to yank this off, and it honestly might not even go back on depending on where the hood stack routes. But here is your EGR here, and then your anti-shutter valve is right below it. So this whole part here is going to come out all the way to where it comes down into the intake tube, and this is just going to go in its place. But we're going to take all that out, and this pipe here actually runs around the driver's side of the engine and tags in to the manifold. So that is where one of our block off plates is going to go, and if I'm not mistaken, because of what I'm doing with the exhaust, that's the only block off plate that's going to be needed. But we will show the install of this once we get all this off and in the next video. But we're going to go ahead and start pulling this assembly here off, so that way we can get to the back and under the car. Okay, so the bolts that are going to hold your EGR on are going to be T30s. You're going to have two right there. This is actually going to be your triple square, and that is going to be a 10mm triple square. And then to pull all of this off, this is going to be another Torx, and I want to say it's going to be a T30 as well. And then you will just have a hose clamp right here to pull that intake tubing off. So we'll go ahead and start doing that. Okay, so this time lapse is a little over 2 minutes, and if you don't want to watch it, you really don't have to. It is just going to be footage of me pulling the EGR and the ASV out of the car. But if you want to sit here and watch it, you can. I will give a couple of little tips and whatnot to getting this thing out. The intake tube that comes up from the bottom, in my opinion, needs to be the first thing that you remove. I think that is probably where I messed up. The hose clamps are not exactly the best to access, especially the bottom one. But once you get that bottom one busted loose, and you can get that pretty much 45-ish degree boot out of there, the EGR and the ASV can come straight down after you pull off the exhaust feed for the EGR and the bolts and unplug it, obviously. I will say that I did fight that boot by itself for, I don't know, probably 30-ish minutes or so, which is kind of why the time lapse is so long. But I would recommend trying to get that out first, and if you can, it will make that a whole lot easier, because basically after that the EGR and the ASV will come out, and you can take the EGR and the ASV out together as one piece, or you can split them. It's really up to you. When I took them out, they ended up coming out as one piece, so it really wasn't a big deal now that I had that 45 degree boot out of the way. So whatever makes it easiest, whatever you think is easiest, just remember, you know, if I were to do it again, I would get that off first and foremost, just to make it easier, give you a little bit of room to be able to drop the EGR and the ASV down. Volkswagen packaging is pretty tight, so just take that into thought. Okay, so now the EGR and the ASV are out. EGR is going to be the top valve here, with your ASV or anti-shutter valve being there. Basically it just feeds your exhaust into that little valve right there in that black hole through this tube here, and like I said, it routes around through the manifold. And I'm not gonna lie, I fought this little piece of intake tube for a little bit, but it'd be easiest if you could get this off first. It would give you a whole lot more room to get in here. The way that Volkswagen has this packaged is super tight, and it fits in. You're gonna have one longer bolt that comes all the way through here, and then you're gonna have two shorter ones here, and all of those bolts are going to be what is right here. And like I said, those are either going to be a T30, which is a Torx, or your triple square 10 that will come in here. But now that we have that out, I'm going to have to see exactly what I'm gonna have to do to get this pipe here off of the manifold in the bottom. So we are now gonna move to the bottom for all of the pulling of the exhaust and whatnot. Okay, so we're now under the car, and we are going to work on taking the exhaust out. As you can see there, I'm really not sure how we're going to get the very end out just yet, but what I'm going to do is I am going to pull this clamp here, which is the one that connects your third section to the very end of the exhaust. Then I will pull this clamp here, unplug this, and this center section here will come out. After that, I will pull this clamp up here that connects it to the downpipe and all of that, and then we'll pull this section out here. And then I know that you've got to drop the CV joint, or the CV axle rather, and we'll take that bracket off and whatnot, but that'll be for when we get up there. So we'll go ahead and start working on this, and we will get these two middle sections pulled out to give us some room to work with. So this time lapse here is about a minute or so long, and for any tips getting the exhaust out, I would recommend doing it the way that I did it, but the most forward point of this exhaust where it meets the downpipe, it does have an O2 sensor in there that I did miss, and I just overlooked it, to be completely honest with you, and I had to do a little bit of stuff that I didn't want to. I kind of put my foot up against that piece of exhaust and then broke the O2 sensor loose, which wasn't terrible, but it wasn't ideal. So if you can break that exhaust O2 sensor loose before you get it down, it'd make it a whole lot easier. And just as a reminder, that is a 3/4 inch O2 sensor, so just food for thought. Okay, so the exhaust is going to be routed like this in the car. You will have an exhaust flange here, which comes from the downpipe. You're going to have a valve here, which is going to have a plug that comes off here. And then you will have a O2 sensor here that is going to be a 3/4 inch. And you can get it down and then bust that loose, but I had a hard time doing it, so don't know if I'd exactly recommend that. The little flange that's here, those are going to be two 13mm bolts. The flanges that are here that connect these two pieces and then connect this to the downpipe assembly are going to be 5mm Allen keys. So now we're going to start on the very rear and getting the very front out where it mounts to the turbo back there. Okay, so we are now going to focus on the very front portion of the exhaust, pretty much the piece that connects right to the turbo. So you will have to take the CV axle down from the transmission, like I said. So it's going to be these bolts here. I'm not going to get to that just yet, but you are going to have these bolts here, which are a 16 millimeter. It's just a heat shield. We'll go ahead and take that out, get that out of the way. We will take these bolts loose up there. Those are going to be 13 millimeter bolts. And then, like I said, the bracket back here, which are going to be another set of 13 millimeter bolts, just to kind of clear some stuff out of the way. And then once we get all that stuff down, we will see what else needs to break loose. Obviously the flange on the turbo, and there's an O2 sensor up there, possibly that little Allen key flange right there, but we'll start taking all that down. Okay, so this time lapse is about 1.5 minutes long, and the reason that I'm talking through these time lapses is, you know, just to give a few hints and whatnot, and, you know, findings from when I did it, because all of these jobs I'm doing for the first time as well, and I don't want you to fight it like I did. But once you get to this point, this is going to be a two-person thing. You are going to need somebody to step on the brake for you in order for the CV axle not to turn whenever you are trying to break the bolts loose. These bolts are pretty tight, which are the triple squares that are around the CV joint that goes into the transmission. And one thing that I would recommend, and I just did it for my sake, is I would match mark the CV axle if, and I'm not saying it will happen, but it could happen if you rotate that CV axle in such a way that it doesn't like it. It could induce a vibration just because it's never been at that point before. So I always just like to put things back where they came from, because I know I didn't have any vibrations before, and I wouldn't like to put any on there. So one other thing though is the clearances are pretty tight on that CV axle, so getting you know, the right tooling in there to get it loose is pretty tough, but you can still do it. Okay, so as you can see, we've got all that removed. I have got the joint on the CV axle removed. I have got that flange right there on the exhaust removed. I've got this mount right here removed, and also have this mount right here removed. But we are going to jump to the top and start taking things off from the top so we can get a little more clearance and get some movement in this, since it's still attached to the turbo, so we can get that mount out of the way and start pulling off each little thing to get this DPF and all this whole system out of here. Okay, so we're up here at the top of the engine bay towards the firewall, and from what I'm seeing is I'm going to take this heat shield off right here. I'll bust this O2 sensor loose right here, and then I am going to take the clamp off of the turbo there and hopefully be able to see some more and get some more movement to where I can reach my hand down and get some more fittings off, but we'll jump into that. Okay, so this time lapse is about 50 seconds long, and if I have any advice for the top of the DPF, and I'm going to say it later in the video, but it is just going to be cutting the two hoses that come from that little sensor or whatever it is on the passenger side that is right by the coolant reservoir. They are going to come out if you are putting the whole downpipe assembly or a hood stack. So really and truly, just cut them. Don't try to fight them and unhook them like I did. It wasted about 20 minutes. So that would probably be one thing that I would recommend doing here. Other than that, it's pretty straightforward at the top of this DPF. Okay, so I ended up turning the time lapse off because this thing was fighting me, but there is going to be an O2 sensor right there. You will have your exhaust bung right there. And then as the light falls, these two hoses right here, they come off of this little module here. I'm assuming that it is something emissions. Obviously that's, you know, it's not going to go back in, but I ended up having to cut those, as you can see right there. And that was just because they were not coming off. There is two, I'm assuming, sensors for the DPF that will unscrew from there as well. And it is loose. I'm trying to find somewhere good to put the light without it falling, but the DPF is loose, as you can see. So I am going to go to the bottom and start trying to wiggle it out. Hopefully nothing else is connected to it. I'm not going to time lapse that, but I will kind of let you know how it goes getting it out. But after that, we will be pulling the EGR cooler out, and you can see the EGR cooler right there behind it, where those two metal lines are. So we'll go to the bottom, start trying to snake this thing out of here. So after fighting it for a while, I did end up getting it out, and what I had to do was I ended up cutting it. Just got a saw out and ended up cutting it right there at the flange where it bends. If you don't do that, I really don't think you're able to get it out. But the DPF is out now, and we will go to the back and take the rear part of the exhaust off and then focus on the EGR cooler. The EGR cooler is right back there. As you can see, it's running along the engine block. Don't think it's going to be too bad taking that off, but we shall see. Okay, so we're now under the car looking at the bottom of the EGR, and I think that, as I move my flashlight, I think that you're just going to have to remove that bolt there, and then that bolt there. There may be a few more at the top, and then a few coolant lines, but we'll get to removing that. I won't be able to time lapse that just because of how congested everything is down here, but I will show you everything that I disconnected after I disconnected it and where it comes from, as well as the size that you'll need. Okay, so as you can see, the EGR is now out. This is going to be your manifold here. This right there is the pipe that I was talking about that ran across the driver's side of the engine, and that's going to need a block off plate. But right up there, there is going to be another bung that we're going to have to plug up, and the EGR delete kit came with that. I did have to pull the oil coolant line, or the the turbo oil line, sorry, which mounted right up there and goes here. But that is the only additional thing that I had to pull the EGR out. And when you pull this off, it does not leak very much oil. So now we're going to start working on trying to get that out right there, and then the rear of the exhaust. So here is the EGR itself. You have a coolant line here, coolant line here. You'll have a plug here, and you do have two mounting bolts here, as you can see there, and then you've got a mounting bolt there and a mounting bolt there. All of that is going to be a T30 or a 30 Torx, and then that is the line that feeds into the turbo. This thing was actually a little bit of a pain to get out, but was not nearly as bad as the DPF once I cut it. I did end up ripping the wires out of that sensor right there. Don't really think it's going to matter, but I did because I couldn't get it loose. When I was trying to bust it off, it pulled the wires out. So as you can see up here though, it clears up quite a bit of room back here, so I think it should be pretty smooth sailing from here. Okay, so I kind of changed my mind on what I was going to do. I was going to route this, or take this whole tube off all the way from the back, but looking from the bottom and then looking from over here, this is just going to be too much of a hassle. Too much stuff's going to have to come out. So I decided that I'm just going to block it off here. This flange is the same, so it's really not that big of a deal, but I will block it off here. I'll probably bend it a little bit out of the way so it's not, you know, in the way. But I am going to have to cut this bracket here. I'll probably just cut it there, and that is because when I looked at the race pipe, it is going to be hitting there. But once I cut that and get these stuff back on at the bottom, as far as the oil line for the turbo, we should be ready to pull off the rear of the exhaust. Okay, so I cut the bracket right there. Really won't be in the way now because of the race pipe, but I will go ahead and go back to the bottom and make sure that everything is wrapped up as far as the turbo line, and then we will pull the rear of the exhaust out. I'm probably going to end up having to cut that off too. I think that this thing here can come out though, because both of the lines did run to just EGR stuff, or DPF stuff rather, so I think this whole assembly can come out. So I'll probably just unplug here, pull that whole thing out. We'll see if it throws a check engine light for it, but so far so good. All right, so we are pretty much wrapped up down here. I have put the CV axle back. I did get a little ahead of myself on the install because I'm honestly tired of crawling in and out of under this car. But here is where your 90-degree fitting goes to reroute your coolant that originally ran to your EGR. And up there you can see that plug that goes into the backside of the turbo. That is what fed the EGR. We have got the oil drain for the turbo back into the block, as you can see there. And the sensors, all we're going to do with that is just tie those up like that. But we're pretty much wrapped up down here. I just have to put the heat shield around the CV axle, which is right there. We'll tie up some sensors up there, and then we will be cutting the exhaust off in the back because I really don't feel like trying to snake it out and fight it. And then we will start with the install of the rest of the things. So the removal of the most rear portion of the exhaust, nothing exciting about that. Here is where you connect to your clamp that we took off earlier from one of those midsections. You just have two hangers there, and then you got another hanger here. What I did is, because I'm tired of fighting everything getting out of this car, I just went ahead and cut it. If I get an exhaust, it'll be a full exhaust anyway, so I'm not really too worried about it. And then at the very rear, you're going to have two 13mm bolts that are going to hold another bracket on there for another exhaust hanger, but I decided to just cut that off. And on this exhaust hanger here, it's going to look like there is a bracket under the car, but it's not. It is for the fuel cell. So this is everything that you are going to get out. This, and here are all going to be parts of your exhaust. And they were a pain to get out, I will say, but it's not the worst. The EGR was a little bit of a pain to get out, but just remember to take off the oil drain for the turbo before you pull this off. Not really that big of a deal. But one thing to mention is this deal, and I'm not even sure what it is, it needs to come off before you try pulling the DPF out, just so you can have clearance and you'll be able to get to different bolts and stuff. But one thing that I will mention here, do not be afraid to cut these hoses. There's two hoses right here that run from this little module here. Do not be afraid to cut them. They are not going to go to anything. They went both to exhaust things, so I'm assuming that they are tuned out. Really not a big deal. But this is where we're at, and just as a reminder, I am not going to pull this tube here. I am going to put the block off plate straight on it, just because I don't feel like fighting everything and really getting under everything. But now we're pretty much at the point where we can start the install of the hood stack and the race pipe. And just as a reminder, here is the stack, and it is from Dark Side, and then this is the so-called race pipe. This does have a bung in it. I will put the links to this in all of the videos. So hope y'all enjoyed that one. It was a little bit of a pain, not gonna lie. I worked at it for a few hours, and then I decided to get the saw out and start cutting everything. So now we will go ahead and jump on to part 2 of the install.